You may be buying products made by children or forced labor and not even know it. World Vision has found that $34 billion of high-risk goods came into this country last year alone. Products that may be enabling horrific working conditions that exploit the most vulnerable. The study looked at the supply chains of hundreds of Canadian companies, and now it's calling for more information about where your T-shirts, your soap, your tea and coffee are coming from. Simon Luchuk is Senior Policy Advisor with World Vision Canada. Simon, what does your study tell us about the state of the supply chain here in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. The study we put out today really draws the links between child and forced labor and the fact that it's a Canadian issue. This is an issue that affects Canadian consumers and Canadian companies.
Can you give us some examples of sort of what you found and why Canadian consumers should be concerned?
Sure. We looked at 50 items that we know are at high risk of being produced by child and forced labor coming from high-risk countries. And we found that last year, $34 billion worth of goods that are at risk of child and forced labor were imported into Canada. And that's about 1,200 companies, over 1,200 companies were importing these goods.
And what kind of, like, are we talking about everything from T-shirts to, what are we actually looking at here?
You know, Peter, it's a lot of the goods that you and I use every day, everything from our shirts to our cell phones, the food we eat and consume, the shoes that we wear. These are, very much everyday products that Canadians use. And
we're talking about child labor and forced labor. Is that essentially slave labor?
Yeah, so these are two related but slightly different phenomena. We would say that both are, amongst the most egregious labor practices in the world. We have 85 million children who are working in dirty, dangerous, and degrading jobs. And then in addition, we have 21 million people who are forced to work, essentially in slave-like conditions. 5.5 million of those are children as well.
Oh my goodness. So, the hard part is when you're back here and you're walking down, Rideau Street or Queen Street, and you just want to go in and you need to buy something fast and cheap. You just grab it off the shelf, pay for it, and move on. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about where this came from, the conditions it was made under. What do we do about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think increasingly consumers are starting to be more conscious about the goods we buy, the things we wear and we put into our bodies, and the conditions under which they were made. One of the things that we would like to see is simply for the companies who are importing these goods to be more transparent in terms of how these goods are ending up on our store shelves and under what conditions they were produced.
And I think you identified it, the number is 1,264 companies that could be part of the problem. This is not a limited issue here.
No, and that's a very conservative estimate too. Of that 1,200 companies, 2/3, about 860 some odd, are Canadian headquartered companies. So again, these are clearly Canadian issues, and we'd like to see more action taken, whether it's from consumers or for the companies or from the government as well.
Are you naming the companies and the specific products?
Yeah, so in our report, we provide a snapshot of how some of the larger Canadian companies are faring in terms of how transparent they're being to disclose information to consumers and to investors, to talk about not just what sort of policies they have in place, but what sort of practices and due diligence do they have in place to address the risks of child and forced labor. And these are all companies who are importing these high-risk goods.
And are there some of those companies that stand out for you that you feel Canadians should know are importing these high-risk goods?
Well, these are companies that we all know and shop at by and large. There are some of our big retailers, grocery stores, and there are some Canadian companies who are really doing a good job in leading the way in terms of being transparent on these issues. Companies like MEC, HBC, BlackBerry, Gildan. These are some of the Canadian companies who really have developed some good best practices in this place.
And you also talk about, I think it's the UK and California that have come up with ways of trying to regulate this a bit better and putting pressure on companies to have sort of better disclosure policies. What is that?
Yeah, so the UK and California have both passed what is called supply chain transparency legislation, and it's meant to encourage companies to simply report on what they're doing, if anything, to address these risks, and then letting consumers and investors ultimately be the judge and to use that information to engage in dialogue with companies. And the idea being that simply by reporting on what efforts companies are taking, this will spur them on to greater action. And we'd like to see this here in Canada as well.
So here we have this now body of knowledge, and it sort of builds atop a body of knowledge that was already there and an awareness that was already there. You tell us that consumers want more information about this. What do you do? Is it now turned to lobbying to try to enforce some regulations? What's the next step?
In our report, we have some very specific recommendations for consumers, for companies, encouraging that dialogue. But yes, we've been engaging with the new government here in Ottawa on the issue of developing supply chain transparency legislation, and really hoping that we can get a clear commitment from the government to move towards this and to work with different stakeholders to find out the best way to implement this here in Canada.
Well, I tell you what, as that moves forward, stay in touch with us because we would like to follow up on this. But for now, Simon, I think we're going to have to leave it there.
You got it. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.